The topic today we're talking about is big data-driven DevOps. I thought I'd try and get a lot of buzzwords into one title. Acting on feedback loops from a digital business. There you go. So this is actually, I think, a really important area of discovery. We're looking at DevOps very widely accepted in the marketplace, providing a lot of benefits. We're seeing it adopted by companies of all sizes, large enterprises, obviously web-scale businesses. As it gains maturity, as it gains scope and increases velocity, a lot of organizations are trying to deal with how do they measure this? How do they know what's going on? How do they get visibility into it? How do they measure the outputs? What are the feedback loops they need to use? How do they get that information? How do they close the feedback loops between production and development, and also into DBAs, into network and security, and a lot of other ways? So today we're going to talk a little bit about where that data comes from, what it means, how you use it, whether it's important or not, and which metrics matter, with some pretty impressive panelists, I have to say. Let me introduce them briefly. First on your left, I'll start with Gordon Haff. Gordon is a Senior Cloud Strategy, Marketing and Evangelism Manager from Red Hat. In the middle there we have David Bilbrough, a Product Evangelist from Adobe. And at the end, Paul Peisner, the Customer Success Specialist from CollabNet. I mean, these are some pretty important businesses and some pretty impressive people. I'll ask them briefly to just introduce themselves before we get into a whole bunch of Q&A. At some point, I will ask for questions from the audience if there are any. Don't feel any pressure, but you can stand up and ask some questions. It's a big room, so I won't be able to take questions on the fly, but I will ask for them. But first, Gordon, do you want to just give us a quick little bit of intro on yourself, who you are, what you do at Red Hat, what Red Hat does even?
Sure. Gordon Haff. I usually go by technology evangelist rather than my big clunky official title for obvious reasons. But basically, I kind of start off doing all things cloud at Red Hat. And what that really means in practice is I'm looking across platforms as a service, like OpenShift, infrastructure as a service, OpenStack, been very involved in containers. So really trying to look at the things that affect business outcomes at the end of the day across the technology stack.
Excellent. Sounds good. So Dave, do you want to give us a little bit of background on yourself and what you're doing here in Adobe as well?
I would love to. So as the product evangelist for the Adobe Marketing Cloud, I work across Adobe products and across verticals with a lot of our largest, most successful customers, helping to architect what they're doing with their customer experience and how they're using our software.
Super. And Paul, I mean, we know each other well, but do you want to let the audience know what you're doing here with CollabNet?
So CloudNet's been around for a long time. We've worked with a lot of organizations, and we're working with people as they try to modernize. And we tell people that we embrace their legacy realities, and we participate in their modernization dreams. And I work with a lot of organizations that get stuck with historic investments and are exploring new digitalization efforts.
Excellent, excellent. I tell you what, I want to work with someone who what was the expression? We participate in your modernization dreams.
Yeah.
Dude, that's
Well, you're
awesome.
stuck in your legacy reality.
I like it. That is brilliant. Hey, look, I've got a couple of questions that I want to ask you before we at some point get to the audience. Firstly, DevOps, right? We talk about DevOps. DevOps is a movement, it's a philosophy, it's about people, it's about empathy, it's about sharing, it's collaboration between teams, it's integration and communication. Does data matter with this? Gordon, I'll start with you. Where does data fit in all that?
Data's a passing fad. DevOps is all kumbaya, love fest. No, I mean, of course, data matters. I mean, DevOps, I think properly, we do talk a lot about, spend a lot of time talking about culture and empathy and transparency and things like that. But ultimately, you kind of need to understand where you are, where you all go, whether you're succeeding, and you can't do that without data.
Absolutely. I mean, Dave, you know, when you think about data in DevOps, where do you see it coming from? What's the importance there of data?
With a lot of our customers, particularly some of the larger ones, we see so many things happening at one time across an organization and so many overlapping project cycles that having the correct data points to understand where resources are being are being used, what sort of productivity different resources have, different testing cycles. I mean, those are all data points that are critical to being successful.
Makes sense. Paul, data, how does it fit into the DevOps landscape, into the touchy-feely fluffiness?
It's interesting because data lives in a different place today than it did 10 years ago. You have a lot of organizations moving quicker. They're embracing agile. They're working in smaller teams. Those teams are switching out tools almost every project, depending on the product type that they're delivering. The industries that they deliver to are completely different, so they've got all kinds of objective obligations that they have to meet while they're trying to work. And then you've got people rotating in and out of companies. So the knowledge base that would have just kind of transferred between folks is out there. The only way you're going to capture and learn and improve is really to listen to those teams, the feedback and the data, big and small, in the context of a project, because that project is the only thing that you'll have when it's done, because the teams will move on to the next thing. So there's got to be a way to capture the objective data, and it's got to be both big and small data so that you can improve those teams the next time they do something similar.
So, Paul, I'll stay with you for a moment because I want to follow up on that. Who is the consumer of this data? If the teams themselves are sort of small and they're able to have conversations directly back and forth and they can share information with each other, who then otherwise would be the consumer of this DevOps data, for want of a better word?
So it's actually an interesting thing. So DevOps for us is really, so we always joke about, is it little dev and big ops, or is it big dev and little ops? And who's driving the conversation? And in some cases, if a true DevOps environment and it's an operational environment where they're trying to do a steady state collaborative view into what is the target location for this living app, where's it going to go? Typically, ops wants to see the data before. They want to know what the risks are coming in. They also want to make sure that there's a continuous improvement feedback loop, so that when it comes in poorly, they've got a place they can go back and fix it. But if you're talking about actually consuming the data itself, there's product owners that want to consume this. They want to do a better job at engineering, and they also want to improve the mastery skill sets of the participants, short-term contractors, long-term employees. They need to be listening to the prior teams that worked on similar projects. So they're consuming the learned data. How they would actually consume it would be different than someone who's trying to run a product line and someone who's trying to run an environment where everybody's got to live even though the tools and teams are changing.
Yeah, Dave, yeah, obviously Adobe is very sort of future forward in terms of these agile processes and so forth. Do you see these sorts of consumers, do you see them sharing these sorts of data? Do you see this sort of use case with data amongst those teams and beyond?
Oh yeah, almost everywhere we go. I mean, there's such a need to not just have the data, but to evangelize the data and discuss the data and break the data out throughout the organization that you almost can't do it fast enough. And that's part of when I'm talking to project teams at the outset of a large transformation. I talk about understanding your project KPIs, but also your development KPIs, so that you're keeping a strong finger on the pulse of the health of what you're actually building.
What sort of KPIs do you think matter? It's actually a topic which I hear about quite a lot in DevOps conferences, the idea of metrics that matter, right? Some matter and some don't. And you talk about the KPIs at a business level, the KPIs at a team level. What sort of KPIs do you see as sort of the metrics that matter?
It depends on what stage your project is in and what type of development you're doing. I mean, we see a lot of efficiency metrics that are very important. We see a lot of Slack metrics, and not the chat tool, but how much Slack your project actually has before your delivery. We see a lot of concentration around errors and QA testing. As a cycle goes on. So I mean, there's probably a lot of different ones to take into account depending on what stage you're in.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Mm-hmm. Gordon, how do you see these data driving actual success? I think it's important to measure, and we've a little bit of that historical analysis is really good. But when you're looking at DevOps, often we're looking at how do we drive business goals and drive success. How does data play into that?
Right, and I think that's absolutely right. That all those KPIs are very important. We should absolutely be measuring them. On the other hand, I think it's very easy to get into this sort of default of let's measure what's easy to measure from a technical point of view, as opposed to what we really want to. And and I think on the flip side, is company revenue a measure of DevOps success? Well, probably not, because it's probably too many steps removed. But I mean, I think what we do see is things like customer satisfaction, for example. Various measurements that have to do with responsiveness of your website, shopping cart abandons, those kind of measurements, things that kind of touch customers or that touch directly revenue or profit in some way. And sometimes that can be challenging. That may not be easy metrics to put in place, but to a degree you can do that. You're really getting at what matters at that point.
I mean, and interesting, because Adobe's a SaaS company, right? In a lot of ways, you provide. I know. I got a subscription. So I know you're a SaaS company in a lot of ways. Do you think there's value? Is that something maybe Adobe's doing in measuring engagement? I know some customers of ours are. Is that?
I mean, not just are we measuring our own engagement internally, but we're helping our customers measure their engagement.
Of course, because the Adobe Marketing Cloud is pretty impressive.
Absolutely.
Yes.
In case you're familiar with Adobe Analytics, it's a tool to help measure engagement and help drive engagement metrics.
Yeah, perfect. Paul, we've talked about the types of data we're looking at. Where does it come from? What is the sources of data? And maybe you could touch on me for a little bit. What's big data and what's little data in terms of the measurement that we're trying to do around DevOps?
So we believe we have a unique history in the tech industry that gives us a chance to kind of measure what is important, what's not important. And we see the tools changing, and so the tools actually give us a good view. We have kind of a funny little saying when we're working with people. We want the tools to be as open and transparent as the people. We want the people to be open and transparent, and that typically means you got to be able to trust. So the data is coming out of the tools. It's coming with the activities of the people, and we map those activities so that you can go back and look at what people have learned and based on security settings and elements, because not all of our folks are born in the cloud. We have some government agencies and folks that work in highly secured environments. But based on their interests, their security levels, their project types, they can compare and contrast, they can borrow things. They can learn from each other. So typically at one level, you've got small data in a project, fast-moving decision-making becoming the background for predicting how quickly a project like this gets through your internal staff. If you've got skill sets, if you don't have skill sets, if you need to outsource functionality, if you need an operational person to participate in the team itself so that you're transferring knowledge, you need to kind of schedule those out and understand where that data comes from and how do you get both soft and hard data, big and little data, and then how do you put it together in a way that you can efficiently improve both the delivery of the products as well as improve on the efficiencies, cost lowering efforts.
Gordon?
Yeah, I guess one thing just to add to that is kind of from my perspective, and I've written a fair bit and worked with storage and big data, and I think, frankly, as an industry, we're kind of moving away from kind of thinking about this specific big data thing and moving maybe more towards useful data, because I think in many cases there's been this tendency to store a lot of data, whether it's from DevOps or something else, and the reality is we don't really use it or don't obtain actionable information from it, and that's got a negative ROI.
Right. And big data is tough because you don't know you need it until you know you need it, right? So, for us, what we do is we keep the projects in context. And so if the project's never visited, it's a one and done, it's a throwaway effort, right? It's not part of those pieces. And nobody has to enter the data. It's just their activities are tracked in such small incremental pieces that if it is important and if there's some patterns and anti-patterns you want to look for, you can actually have alerts kick off and trigger while they're in flight, and you can encourage collaboration before there's a surprise, right? Just because you can start seeing trending activity that typically ends up in a conversation that's not so great.
And one thing, Paul, that you raised, which I want to go back to a little bit, is security of data. So if you're getting all this data, some of this is very sensitive, right, potentially, especially if you're talking about application data, test data, very much so if you're talking about production data and transaction data. And these are all sources you can bring into the DevOps lifecycle to understand how you're doing, where you're going fast, whether you're getting errors, diagnose those problems. What do you do about security and compliance? I mean, Dave, maybe, I don't know if that's, obviously with SaaS customers, you've got some pretty significant and compliant customers. You know, how do you deal with that sort of thing when you're a DevOps team working with data?
Well, you know, so security is at the forefront of nearly every customer discussion I have these days, and certainly some of our biggest product advancements this year, we now support a full alphabet soup of certifications on the security side. And you know, that may have not seemed very exciting at our summit this past year, but to me it was one of the more exciting announcements that we made, because it required so much work on the back end to get up to various levels of certification, which you know, for a lot of our customers is very important. I mean, we are seeing now techniques in customer experience that are you know, were only common in like hip media companies 6 and 7 years ago. We're seeing banks do that kind of stuff now, and of course they have you know, banks, insurance companies, everybody else have an entirely different level of scrutiny for their data. So we're seeing the same types of problems from the DevOps team in terms of having to protect that data that, you know, we never thought about when we invented some of these technologies 10 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. Gordon, individual practitioners getting data. I mean, you know, this idea that I'm getting data, I'm sharing data, I'm closing feedback loops, it sounds great. Tell us a little bit about what you think at the coalface. So an individual practitioner, someone in development, someone working with code every day, an operator who's configuring and building systems and making sure the site's reliable. What are they looking for on a daily basis? What sort of data are they looking for? Where do they get it? How do they use it?
Well, I think you have a lot of different data, and you have a lot of different practitioners in the organization. You've got security folks, ops folks, dev folks. You've got the product managers. You've got the, you know, you've got the IT executives and so forth. So I think the key here really is that you have data that is relevant to all of these different people, but you don't necessarily try and figure out what's relevant to who in advance, but really you rather provide this common access to all of these folks so that they can extract and maybe provide them with additional tools so they can tailor dashboards for their own use and so forth, so they know what's relevant to them.
That makes sense.
There's a security element that a lot of the open source tools that we support typically don't have any security consciousness around them. And when people are collaborating, you tend to see everything everybody's working on, and that's been an issue for a lot of organizations. So what we do is we class the project, and based on the tools that are associated with that project, you may or may not see the tool based on your login. But that assumes that we're incorporating the security settings of the individual from the company. They understand the project type and their role in the company. So based on all three of those, they may or may not see resources that are outside the scope of what they need to see. And that's kind of the learnings from our federal environment that we have to work with. And we bring that down to small startups, because in some cases they're working with big companies and they don't have security backgrounds, and they don't understand that concept of protecting the customer's project. So it is something we're constantly working on, and we have that concept for small startups is new. For bigger organizations, it's expected, and they're surprised when they find out that the tools they're picking, they don't have it.
There's a point in there that I think is really interesting as well. You know, you talk about getting this secure, this confidential data and sharing amongst teams. You know, DevOps is all about sharing.
Right.
Should we be sharing more of that data even though it's confidential? Do we trust our internal teams especially? I mean, is that... This may be a bit confronting, I think, for some organizations. I talk to banks or you know, three-letter agencies, for example, and they're very locked down, right? They don't want to share even internally some of this information. Is that holding people back, do you think? Going, Dave, maybe?
I haven't observed it as holding back personally, but I can see with a lot of customers the amount of planning that goes into what data goes where, especially from a architectural perspective. I mean, the way that our tools are flexible, we see organizations building out different groups to work on different parts of different DevOps teams to work on different parts of their customer experience, and the tools allow for that. I mean, we don't really see a lot of stumbling blocks with it, but I can certainly see how that would be a challenge.
I mean, this is something that I read a book not that long ago by General McChrystal, and he talks about, I think the book is actually called Team of Teams, and he talks about this new approach, and he's talking about the theater in Iraq and stuff, but it applies, I think, interestingly enough, I think it applies to the DevOps methodologies, especially in a larger organization, this idea that you have your team, that's to your point, one DevOps team's doing one set of stuff, but you've got other DevOps teams for whether that's a pattern or an anti-pattern, we won't go into. But this idea of sharing data amongst the team of teams, Gordon, is this something that you see, certainly in Red Hat, as a very open organization?
Right. Yeah, so I mean, so Red Hat's a very open organization. I think it's fair to say our internal DevOps practices for the software that we're developing for internal use certainly is pretty open and transparent sharing among the company as a whole. I think it would be considered an anti-pattern at Red Hat were it not. On the other hand, clearly we have consultants working with federal government, working with large banks. In many cases, there's lots of laws in place, and no, obviously they can't share openly all of their practices and everything that they're doing with the company more broadly. So, yeah, you'd love this open, transparent sharing everywhere, but you also have to recognize, in some cases, that's not just a suboptimal process, it's illegal. So you just can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to what Dave was saying earlier on. The Hail Mary's really, that's what gets the views and everything, but you haven't got a line that's blocking and tackling in front of you, you never get that pass off, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's pretty funny for us because we're all about the open sharing. And we'll walk into organizations that are competing with other product lines within the organization, and they will have used my open tool to set up silos where they're not sharing. And we have to come in and say, that's not really a good practice, because you want people to jump over lines and to jump into projects and contribute, but if they don't know they're there, they can't help. And
yeah,
so,
I mean, I think the reality is there needs to be a happy medium that's appropriate for the organization and for the project. It's fine to say everything should be free and happy and open and transparent on the one hand. On the other hand, you certainly have conservative organizations like say, no, we have to have complete silos. And the reality, I think, is usually that it should be somewhere in between those two.
So, I mean, we're here, it's CloudEXPO, it's DevOpsSummit, but it's also big data, it's Internet of Things Expo. If we're talking about big data and getting data and using it in DevOps, what's the interaction between the perimeter data, like edge data, whether it's, I mean, from mobile devices, it's pretty straightforward. Mobile devices and mobile applications, that's one form of edge data. But we've also got other kinds of business data, potentially, that's out at the edge. Is that sort of data exhaust useful for a DevOps team? Can we apply that to a development methodology, do you think? Paul?
I think the feedback loops coming from anywhere are really helpful. So in your user stories, now we have customers that do medical devices that have Internet of Things strategies. And those used to be dumb devices that would go out there and check in occasionally, but they're actually now collecting data, and when they check back in, they're providing feedback loops. What were we expecting? Does it compare contrast to those pieces? So what we're seeing is as you embrace DevOps, we see two different conversations. We talked about big dev, little ops, and little dev and big ops. When big dev gets involved, they're looking for app ops. What they want is the ability to take an engineering project and own the life cycle of that productization and the full stack responsibilities. Now, they don't pick the operational environments, but they need to be able to see transparently all the way to the customer feedback, to the IoT activities, to make sure what they're working on really is out there. What's really interesting is folks that are enabling IoT and based on the feedback loops, creating new product stories. So the ownership of that, app ops strategy, allowing you to kind of be all in with the engineering efforts and owning the customer and getting the feedback loops, not only from the APM tools, from the service desk, but also from the customer device as well. It's really interesting in terms of where that's going to lead in terms of future engineering efforts.
Yeah. I mean, we're in the business of helping our customers own their customers' experience, and wherever that experience goes, our tools are prepared to help them create the appropriate feedback loops, the appropriate, excuse me, personalization methods. I know my colleague Kevin Lindsay was here yesterday talking about much of the same. I mean, how can we power not just an experience, but a personalized experience, no matter where that experience is taking place?
Yeah, I don't know, for example, your sort of secret shopper kind of data. Supermarket. Some supermarkets and department stores, for example, they'll have, and I've seen this myself. They'll give you a little wristband. You'll get a 10% discount for wearing it throughout your visit to the store, and then that data becomes useful potentially even for an application developer, right?
Absolutely.
Which brings me to a point which I wonder all the time about data, and that's how do you not be creepy with it? And there are lines to draw, right? And I think everyone probably has heard the story of using data. I think it was a large retailer. It's public information, but I don't want to sort of name and shame. But a large retailer looked at data on purchasing patterns and found out that if a woman went into their store and bought a combination of interesting items, including I think a throw rug, moisturizer, and one other thing, and I can't remember what it is, that indicated that that person was probably pregnant, because their patterns and their data analysis showed that they came back to the store later and bought diapers, and they came back and bought cribs and prams, strollers and stuff like that, right? Now, in this instance, they sent off a mailer to that person's house with a whole litany of maternity products. Unfortunately, that was to a 15-year-old girl, and the father immediately got on the phone to the store and abused them for how dare you send this to my young daughter. Turns out she was actually pregnant. The store knew before her father did. Little bit creepy, but what do? It's data. It's just data. It just tells a story. Gordon, I know we've talked a little bit about this. Where do you draw the line with data? Where do you stop collecting data?
I think it's really hard for the creepiness factor because different people have a different tolerance for creepiness. I mean, as you say, there's also a lot of retail optimizations, stadium venue optimizations, using mobile, using data. And a lot of these things, you listen to the pitch, and there's a lot of benefits for the customer. Of course, there's benefits for the venue too, or they wouldn't be doing it. But there certainly are benefits. But then at the same time, we deliver these benefits by knowing where you are in the stadium within 10 feet. We know what you've ordered the last 5 times that you've been here, and we have all that stuff in a database somewhere. And it's hard not to look at that and go, ooh, that doesn't feel quite right. And maybe that's just me being old.
And that's not a bad question. I mean, is it different, do you think, for millennials, for digital natives? I mean, I feel like that, but I also look at some of the failures we've had in the sort of Silicon Valley startup, and Paul, you talked about some of the areas where people don't pay attention to this institutional discipline of IT that we've built up. I'm thinking of one mobile app, for example, which had an open back-end API. They just didn't think that anyone would use it, and they were collecting addresses and phone numbers and all sorts of stuff, and their back-end API, they'd send it up from the mobile device and collect it. And then all of a sudden someone figured out that you could just hit that with a request and you get 10,000 usernames and addresses and phone numbers. I mean, do you think it's different for millennials? They have a different attitude to this creepiness factor?
I do. I think that security is an afterthought. The idea of getting done is so important that I think that you get done and then you think, does it work? And then does it work well? And I think the well is the security question, right? This belief that you can always get better. Well, you can always add security if it becomes an issue. And I think they kind of patch on security. And to me, that's a little bit kind of disconcerting, especially when they're coming out of smaller organizations that were just doing proof of concepts and they don't have that long history of what are the bad things that could happen if you're not closing the doors behind you. Right? They just don't have that experience, and I think they get it really quick, but they react to it rather than kind of plan for it.
Yeah. And Paul, I'm not going to pose this question to you, but this comes back to the idea of institutional discipline, and we go back to things like ITIL, which was mentioned this morning, the idea of a release manager or a release management. Dave, maybe you could address this, because I know, Paul, this is a Dorothy Dixer to you. It'd be too easy. But Dave, the idea of bringing sort of data into the idea of what is done, to define a done project, Paul mentioned security as one area. What other data for a DevOps professional defines done?
I can think of a few that might be pertinent, but one of the things I always try and help establish at the outset is what the iteration pattern is going to look like, because I mean, if I look at my most successful customers, nothing that they do is ever done. It's only, this version or this release is done. And you try to say, worry less about what is done and set your iteration pattern ahead of time. Like, okay, we're going to move and we're going to come back and revisit this within this time period. And then that's a matter of resourcing, I think, but it really helps to make specific to that DevOps team, that organization, and that industry what data is most pertinent for understanding where they are in the release cycle.
Yeah. Gordon, do you have any thoughts on what done is from a data perspective?
From a I think I pretty much echo that. I mean, obviously, most applications that you're still using are going to, you're going to continue to update, and we're going to continue to do security patches and so forth. But I think you could actually, to come back to your ITIL point, Andy, I think we could look to a lot of rather traditional practices here. I mean, a product release, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, a product like that, we have clearly defined phases throughout its life cycle where you're going to have functional enhancements, then you're going to have bug fixes only, and then finally you're going to be predominantly security fixes. And why wouldn't that be appropriate for something you're developing using DevOps? I mean, DevOps is at some level just a development methodology.
So Andy, I wanted to follow up. I know this is easy for me, but a lot of those practices were developed in silos. When operations was separated from release and release was separated from dev, what's interesting now is those practices that were in silos are now blended efforts. So as you have more automation and you can move through those traditional segments faster, with the ownership being far left, being engineering and dev, and having a few roadblocks in the security guardrailing your activities, they limit what the freedoms you have. What you're looking for, or what you learned in test, this idea that you could learn everything you could in test, you can't. So now as you roll in smaller projects, you're actually learning from the APM tools. In your user story, you predicted what performance would look like. You're listening to your service desk. And basically the service desk is getting a surge of unhappy customers, right? And then when you're looking at IoT, you're looking at what did we expect this application to go, or where do we expect the users to go with this? So your ability to listen and respond and stay dynamic with that piece is really important. So I think we do learn from the traditional siloed, fragile best practices when everything was breaking between the walls as we threw them over. As those walls come down, we need to take those best practices and roll them into practical use case scenarios for the engineering folks, so they have line of sight into what do we need to address on our way to being successful.
I actually think it's a really powerful point. It's one of my high horses that ITIL and DevOps are not incompatible.
No, absolutely not.
ITIL may have provided prescriptive ways to do things which, if you followed slavishly, perhaps they would slow your processes down, but it doesn't mean that the fundamental disciplines of ITIL should not be still applied.
No, I think absolutely. If the product is going to live with any kind of customer support, you want to be able to listen to everybody that's standing alongside of that and relay back to the people who could make those changes in the next iteration.
Yeah. And I love that idea of getting input to the development team from your support and your service desk systems. Where else can you get that kind of data? What are the tools, what systems, applications? Dave, maybe... Where do you get this data from? I mean, a service desk is a really good place for some of that data, of course. Where else would you look to other tools maybe?
Gosh, I mean, I've seen just about all manner of information be collected. We've actually, interestingly, the last couple of years, we've observed a trend of some customers tagging internal pages and internal work sites with our analytics tools to help understand how much time some other people were spending on different pages, and just to help understand, is this the right flow? Is this the right, as their people are helping customers, can we get some of that information and look at it in its own report suite right alongside some of the external stuff?
Yeah, makes sense. Gordon, do you see, certainly within Red Hat, or even with your customers, accessing multiple tools for data in the workflow or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think a common pattern is what if you can measure it, it might be useful data. I mean, just some examples is one of the things we've gotten much more aggressive about doing over the last couple of years is the point here is looking at accesses of pages of support information, marketing, sales information, because a lot of this stuff historically you put a lot of work into and you threw it out on the theory that it was probably going to be helpful for someone. And now it's like, people are only reading, white papers that are under 5 pages because they have the attention span of, whatever these days. And that kind of, anything you can, really almost anything you can measure. Now you may then decide this information isn't very useful, so we're going to stop storing it, stop measuring it, but really almost anything like that.
Now, Paul, this time I am going to set you up because I know CollabNet. I was at the session this morning and I've seen some of your demos out in the booth. And by the way, everyone here should go to the Expo area, not right now, but a little bit later in the day, and get some demos from some of our guests and some of our sponsors. But I've seen some of the stuff you're doing around your new tooling, getting inputs from a lot of the DevOps tools. What sort of tools are you getting data from there?
So I think everything that is important to a product line, so every product line, every skill set of the engineering teams, they pick tools that are similar and dissimilar to each other. And the ability to have multivariate projects is absolutely critical because the tools will change, the teams are changing, right? And part of it is listening to any tool that is successfully used. And when the tools are used over and over again, you actually can start looking for the tools to call for help. With a team that's got subject matter expertise in a certain area and you have a Jenkins build failure that is maybe 4 or 5 times more than norm for that group, they may not need help, but it's probably a good idea to go out and find or have a conversation with them, asking if you can change the time box, if you can do a quick swarm and bring a team member on that could have some expertise in an area where they seem to have some trouble with successful builds. Doesn't mean the project's at risk. They may want to just keep learning on those pieces, but the tools themselves actually call for help or show anti-pattern things that might, I guess, be a red flag for risk or potential learning opportunities.
Yeah, I think that actually speaks to something we've kind of maybe danced around a couple of times, is that I think this idea of being able to do things with data predictively rather than wait until they've broken, I think we're still in the pretty early days there, but I think that's going to be big.
Yeah, and I think the more you do things over and over again, the more that predictive data becomes relevant, because other times it's just chatter. And if you know the project from the inside out, you're like, that's normative, that's within the scope of norm. But if everybody agrees what is out of scope, that typically the tools can start asking for help, or that the process can say, hey, early indicators, tell management that their project may be slower or more expensive than they anticipated. But what we're seeing is actually dev teams become more business sensitive, and we're seeing business folks becoming more technically sensitive. With the data that you collect, you're able to do some modeling and to be able to say, we do these kinds of projects really well, and we don't do these kinds of projects really well, so we should outsource it, right? But if you collect that data, you can start getting trending data. The details don't really matter. What does matter is how does it affect the outcome, and how do you stay away from making bad decisions?
There's a lot here, right? There's a lot of data we've talked about, a lot of options, a lot of outputs. But where do you start? Do you need to be a really super mature DevOps organization to start collecting data? If not, where do you start collecting data? I'll actually ask all of you this, but I'll start with you, Gordon.
Yeah, I think one of the key things about DevOps, first of all, is you go to events like this. There's a lot of talk that's sort of really centered around premature DevOps processes, and the reality is DevOps is something you can do one step at a time. And so we've talked about the kind of the best metrics to collect. Just start collecting CI/CD, your Jenkins data, the number of failures, your downtime on your website. The stuff. Do collect the easy stuff to start
Ansible
off.
data, for example.
Yeah, and do some start doing some simple automation. We have a lot of great stories around Ansible, for example, where we just picked this one thing that was taking us a week every couple months to do, and we got down to 2 hours. One thing, and that's a big win. So I think really just start where you can. Don't get analysis paralysis.
Find a problem, fix a problem. Dave, what sort of problem, where would you start with collecting data and feeding it into that feedback loop for DevOps?
I've got a poster in my office that says, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can.
Nice.
It's kind of a mantra, but I try to help customers understand the business that they're in, because a lot of times I see customers taking a one-size-fits-all approach and not really looking at, well, what's really important to my organization? What's really important to my team within the organization, helping to understand their role. From there, it's usually pretty clear what they need to collect and how they need to look at it.
And Paul, same for you. Where would you start?
I asked that question about 6 months ago. I did a survey of enterprise organizations on the West Coast, none of them customers. They were big organizations. Where do you start? And it was funny, is if I wrote to a DevOps, IT, technical-oriented person, he said, start with my people because they're all broken. And it was funny when I did the same survey to my developers and engineers who lived in a world creating things, they said, start with our tools because our IT guys are so backwards, they have no idea what they're doing. But they all agreed the process is a great place to fix. So it really depends on where you live. The thing that needs to be fixed the most is on the other side of the hill. It's never in your own backyard. The reality is both need to be able to adapt. IT wants to be able to be successful delivering services to their developer communities, and the developers want to be successful delivering projects, and they need the flexibility to change tools, and the processes aren't negotiable. There's certain things you have to do to have best practice to guarantee good quality pieces. So the idea is, I would say the culture of a shared goal is really important. You start with culture. Again, CloudNet trains more people than anybody else in the world on Agile certification. It's not perfect. It's a great place to start because you learn about what you didn't know. It kind of questions the presuppositions of what a project should look like and the way you should interact with your team. That's a great place to start. Then the tools that make them successful need to be part of that conversation, need to get wrapped in. And you need to allow for both of those to kind of roll in while not trading away your company's quality concerns or their ability to manage a business. There's always a little bit of a balance there.
Absolutely. Very cool. Now we just have a couple of minutes. I do want to see if there are any questions from the audience. Again, don't feel any pressure. We've got a lot to talk about. We've only got a little bit of time.
Absolutely.
Nope. Okay. We might actually be able to finish on time then. That's okay. So just to wrap up, Gordon, final comments from you on using big data in a DevOps landscape. What would you say the one takeaway you want to send this audience home with is?
I think the one takeaway I would leave with in terms of big data in a DevOps context really is subject to legal and other types of constraints, is you really want to make this data available. I mean, this data is at some level a common tool across all these different constituencies in organization, and giving everyone access to anything that they appropriately have access to is really one of the best ways to get started.
Good one. Dave, what's your one takeaway from today? If our audience can remember one thing, what is it?
I always tell customers, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And by the time you realize you should have been collecting something, it's already too late to have collected it. So focus on really what your contribution to the project, to the business, to the objective is, and then dig deep in terms of what you need to understand to deliver that. And from there, it's usually pretty clear.
Yep. Paul, same question. One takeaway for the audience, what would you tell them?
So I think full stack management is really important. Listening to that stack and allowing for things to cycle in and out of those is really important. Also the full life cycle of the engineering efforts. Those are going to change. They're going to be short. They're going to be long. You've got to be able to accommodate those in the enterprise space and really listen and remember what works. And that means grabbing that data and looking at it holistically. Look at the tools, the people, the practice, and the business outcomes. Roll that together. Don't isolate the data to a segment and get one piece of the conveyor belt working faster. It just doesn't matter. Look at the whole process, and that means kind of do full stack collaborative sharing amongst the engineering staff and the business owners.
Very cool. And I would actually emphasize that, the idea of sharing data broadly amongst multiple teams. I think you get the leverage out of that data you don't get when you keep it in those silos.
Absolutely.
So Paul, where can the audience find you?
Right here.
After the event, how can we get in contact with you? If we want to harass you about your ideas or praise you for being brilliant, where can we get in touch?
So, here at the show, we're actually in one of the booths over there, so please stop by. We're actually running demos every few minutes of the different segments where people can mature. But also, CollabNet is simply, it's collab.net on the web. We've got a couple of places where you can reach out, but that's probably the easiest way on the website.
Brilliant. Dave, where can we reach you after the event?
Certainly LinkedIn or Twitter, or most companies do business with Adobe, so through your Adobe sales rep.
Yeah, that's pretty true.
Yes.
Gordon?
It's Gordon Half. You can Google me and you'll find out way too much about me probably. I'm working at Red Hat. You may know us about Linux, but we're also doing lots of work these days in microservices, platform as a service, container platforms, kind of all these things that play into both developing DevOps applications and running them.
Brilliant. You can always find me on Twitter at AndyMann, ANDIMANN. That's all we have time for our panel. Please, if you could give our expert presenters a round of applause. Gordon Half, Dave Bilborough, Paul Posner, thank you very much.
Thanks.